Something that's actually a very interesting thing to do is to look at declassified documents of things that were conspiracy theories in the past that now we actually know happened because the documents got declassified. And so, there were several in the Vietnam area. The Gulf of Tonkin is a very famous one, but also the firing torpedoes into the water and saying that we had sunk Vietnamese ships to increase the escalation for the war, and things about Operation Mockingbird, Operation Paperclip, COINTELPRO. There's a number of things that are now declassified because those people all died, and where during the time that it was still happening, anyone who said anything about it would be a conspiracy nut. And so, and similarly, when the USSR fell, there was a bunch of declassified stuff that came out in Baltic states. I have a friend that runs a private intelligence company who went to Yugoslavia and pulled the intelligence records then and looked at the way that the KGB built their system of DSM to be able to classify anything that went against the state as a mental illness. And it was very clearly documented how they did it and the ideas behind it. And the whole thing about the way that J. Edgar Hoover was targeting the Black Panthers and all like that wouldn't have been known except that, people broke in and found the shit, right? So does that stuff happen? Yeah, of course it happens. And it happens in the public sector, meaning government, intelligence agencies, military. It also happens in the private sector, right? So when you see the Enron type things, for every Enron, there's a lot of those that happen all the time that just aren't caught. And for every Madoff and whatever. That said, most of the common conspiracy theories that I see are things that I can't find any good grounding for. And they're many of them tend to be far more fantastical than just the kind of typical social science of, yes, of course, groups with really big budgets probably have more advanced tech than is publicly known about. And yes, of course, for national security purposes, some shit is kept secret. And they're actually engaged in war and preparation for war. And so, and yes, the people that get to the top of power stacks get there by being good at getting to the top of power stacks. And that means a bunch of things psychologically in the disposition. Because there will be sociopaths that will want to overturn them, and they will only not get overturned by the draconian measures of the sociopaths if they are better at being able to play that game than they are. We can talk about conspiracy as a function of the system incentives, right? Whatever it is the system incentivizes creates a kind of topology. And the people just kind of move within the shape of that topology. But then they in turn shape the topology. So there's a reinforcing thing. And one of the problems is that sociopaths and sadists are a real thing. And people who are not that actually have a hard time believing that because they have empathy and they are empathizing with what it must be like to be someone else. So they're getting wrong. They have a hard time putting themselves in the position of someone whose inner experience is as different from theirs as it actually is. But, when you look at cluster B disorders, there's a whole set of disorders that are oriented to power, and including abuses of power. So there are not one for one and perfect, not every time, but statistical correlation with positions of high power and psychologies that are oriented to want that. And that means also differential and asymmetric power, meaning use increased power over others to continue to grow and maintain asymmetric power. It's funny how easy it is to see throughout history, right? When we're looking at Genghis Khan or Alexander the Great or Napoleon or whatever, we're like, oh yeah, those guys just went and killed fucking everybody, right? And yet then when we look at the people who are most powerful today, they're genetically the same kinds of people and we have a situation that in some ways seems more civil, but also in some ways just because we hide it better. Like we had a nice Democrat in presidency in the US, and we drone striked a lot of civilians, and for very questionable actual motives. And factory farms are as gruesome as anything that was done in the Dark Ages at a massive scale that almost everybody watching this is paying to make that happen. Right? So it's like, oh, I didn't kill her. I paid a hitman. Well, okay, you fucking paid to have the wet works done. Well, buying something that comes from a factory farm is that, right? You're like paying someone else to do this kind of gruesome wet works. And so the reason I say this is because I want to see us emerge into the higher angels of our nature. But we can only do that if we can also face the reality of the total set of things that the human experience does, and specifically some of the uglier things that it does and the relationship to power that ends up getting. And now, one can also take that too far. Take that as a general set of principles and assume that everyone in a position of power is a child-eating Satanist, which would also be silly. And this is one of the things that I find with regard to conspiracy, is I find that people have an aesthetic bias where anything they hear as a conspiracy, they either just kind of reject it up front. Oh, fucking tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists. They just auto reject it without studying it, even though history shows how much people have conspired, just meaning some people share info with each other to advance shared agendas without sharing it with the public and sharing some disinfo. You can go back to Sun Tzu and read about disinfo and how to do disinfo, right? Like we've been doing that for thousands of years, pretty intelligently and coordinatedly. And so it's interesting how easy it is for people to reject something as, oh, that's dumb conspiracy thinking, when you actually study history. Then on the other hand, there are people who, if they hear any conspiracy, they assume it's probably true. And if they hear that anything came from a authoritative institution, they assume it's probably corrupt. And that's also completely silly, because if the groups were that corrupt, they would be overturned. Like if they were that completely and wholesale corrupt. So there is a balance of that. It's not just evilness that gets them there. It's also effectiveness at a lot of things, right? It is actually the ability to produce and manage and do logistics and the ability to win power games. It's a mix of those things, right? So is everything coming out of a major university or major institution or, government regulatory body a lying conspiracy? No. Is a lot of it at least highly influenced? Yeah. Does that mean that most of the people who are involved even know? No, of course not. Most of the people involved are just doing their job. And they were told to research this, so they're doing a good job of doing honest research on this. Now, the fact that they're researching this as opposed to this, and that there's an agenda as to why to research this as opposed to that, they will never even know that agenda. What this means, though, is that almost everyone lives in a topology that is, like, what do I do for job protection? There are certain things that, like, there's stuff I'm not going to say because I'll lose my job. There's certain stuff I have to say and I have to do to just keep my job. I got to take care of my family. So whatever it is, even if it seems kind of unethical or asshole-ish or not the thing I'd most like to do, it's office policy or whatever. So just for job security, and then for promotion and for ladder climbing, I am going to do the thing that's effective within that space. So basically the incentives and the disincentives, the topology of that space is going to inform my action as an average agent in that space. But some people have asymmetric influence on the architecture of those topologies. And so one of the things that I think most people don't think about enough is that a relatively small amount of fairly sociopathic people can create topologies that lots of otherwise not sociopathic people will participate in towards relatively sociopathic results. So let's say that profit becomes a motive for war. If you study history again, the idea that that's a thing becomes pretty clear. And when you look at the size that military industrial complex is out of the total economic block and the size of the government contracts it gets compared to other areas, whatever, and the fact that if the demand went away, the profit of the supply side would go away, and that it is actually the fiduciary responsibility of all business owners to continue to manufacture demand. We can go back and historically look at cases, right? We can look at Gulf of Tonkin or whatever, where there were false flag events for whatever motives. So let's say there's some fucked up motives that some very small number of people have that end up influencing other people, and the other people are not necessarily even aware of what those motives were. The soldier who is in the battlefield isn't fighting for financial interest, who's risking his life and making a relatively low wage, but he still might be doing something that is, when he is involved in the bombing or the whatever, he still might be killing civilians for wars that should never be fought, and he just doesn't even know that, right? So he's engaged in an activity that we could call a sociopathic activity for non-sociopathic reasons personally. And we can see the same thing in the corporate world, and we can see the same thing in all over the place. This was the SS troop who were being tried in the Nuremberg trials, and how many of them said, no, we actually didn't believe everything we were doing was good. It started out with some ideological stuff, and then it got really fucked up. And then when they were asked, did you try to stop? No. And they all repeated the same German phrases that basically said, officers' orders, we didn't have a choice. And so this property by which, so yes, there's somebody does a really fucked up thing. They don't even make it obvious, or they have some fucked up motives, and they create a set of office policies or command and control policies or whatever it is, and everyone else is just kind of doing their job. And they're even usually told something that what they're doing is valorous or good, right? Scientists who are told they're doing this for one reason, and then it is used for a weaponized purpose inside of military or whatever. And then there's also if one actor is developing a new weapon, all the other actors have to develop the new weapon plus counter weapons. There's the arms race side. So both of those are the situations in which bad actors are capable of affecting an incentive landscape that affects lots of other actors. One of the things we will need for an effective civilization is a way to be able to bind bad actors quickly, which will require the kind of transparency to be able to identify that it is actually bad acting when they're seeking to disinform, which is this question of true information versus faulty information.